Teska and Associates. Teska worked with the city over 20 years ago, just over 20 years ago now, to establish the city's first and only other TIF district. So the city's had a long association with Teska. The subcommittee of the City Council, the Property and Public Lands Committee of the City Council, the PP&L, chaired by Alderman Schoenheider, recently put out an RFP for a TIF consultant, went through interviews, and selected Lee and his firm, again, to be the city's advisor and TIF consultant as we move forward with an exploration of possibly a future TIF. It's not a secret that this discussion of the TIF is related to the city's Laurel Avenue property, the former MS property, Municipal Services property. But importantly, tonight is not about Laurel Avenue. This meeting has not been noticed as a discussion about Laurel Avenue. We thought before the Plan Commission gets into your real technical discussions on TIF and technical discussions about redevelopment plans on Laurel Avenue, that it would be good just to bring all of you up to speed and make sure all of you are operating with a basic knowledge of TIF. And so Lee tonight is here as your expert, as the city's consultant, and it's a chance for you to get to know him. We'll be working closely with him. I think we're very fortunate to have him on board, and certainly from the staff perspective, we're very lucky to have him as an advisor and as really great support for us moving forward over the next year, 18 months, 2 years, whatever the City Council decides on this. At the end of this process, the Plan Commission will make recommendations, and those recommendations will really at this point have to do with whether or not the City Council should pursue a TIF, whether or not the timing's right to look at the Laurel Avenue property, and also some recommendations on ultimately how Laurel Avenue should be redeveloped. But tonight is just educational. As you said, Mr. Chairman, not looking for any action, but just looking to give you a bit of an education. And with that, I'll introduce Lee Brown, and I will ask that you speak from the podium.
Is the clicker up there?
Yes, I think I left it up there. And this meeting is televised, so if you missed something, you can watch it again.
At 3 in the morning.
Yeah. Or if you can't sleep, this will probably put you to sleep. And we can also offer to send you Lee's presentation too by PowerPoint, so don't feel that you have to take notes. I just thought at this point it'd be best just to have it presented.
Kathy, why don't we routinely do that?
Send you the PowerPoint?
Absolutely.
I will do that. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, and I look forward to working with you over the next few months. I will try to keep this at an intelligent level and assume that we are educating both you and the public at the same time. So I apologize if some of this is simply something you already know, but I think it's worth going over it again. There is very few tools that are available to communities to encourage private investment that's not on its own happening. Perhaps the biggest mistake that we've ever made was to label this tax increment financing, because the most immediate response by community members who don't know what it is to assume that it is a tax, and it is not. And so it's worth starting with some basic understanding of what it is, what it does, what it can do, and what it can't. The fundamentals that we start with are a process, and then we'll go into the ability to, the process being how it is established and what it can do. These are very well articulated in a very badly written document, which is to say it's very specific about the steps that have to be taken, but reading it is not going to be something that you're going to enjoy, and you probably will not have to go through the statute, and I will try to do the interpreting for you. The project, a TIF district, starts out by establishing the boundaries of a TIF district. And that's done first by determining whether or not the district is eligible under the statutes, and we'll go into some detail about what creates eligibility. And then it is after a process of public hearing and adoption of a specific set of ordinances, there is a certification by the county on the base value of the improvements and the land within the district at the start. And this is called certification of the base. And it's probably, I think I go into a little bit in later slides, but it's worth noting from the start, it does not freeze the taxes. It does not freeze the base. You're gonna hear that is a frozen base, but it's not, and I'll explain that. It's important to understand that growth in the value of the property over the base is what we call increment. Increment is used to make additional investments in the project area. That is, the expenses that are paid for by the increment that's coming in, used to make public improvements, whether that's within the right-of-way or on property. And ultimately, those improvements encourage private investment, which pays taxes, which is the increment, and goes to pay off the public improvements. So it's a cycle, and it works best when it builds momentum. So, you're not gonna read this, but I'm gonna indicate to you that there is a significant number of tests that are made to determine eligibility. At a minimum, a property has to be at least 1.5 acres. And then it has to have either a designation of blighting or of a conservation district. And there's some differences there, but essentially physical characteristics and characteristics of its ability to be developed or the economic drive for development have to say essentially, this is going in the wrong direction. We don't establish TIF districts that are healthy in the market respects. It is for properties that are, for one reason or another, for their physical reason or the economic reason, have an impediment to the natural market development. We, the city, would have to establish, but for a TIF district, this will not develop on its own. There is a series of other tests that make one or more kinds of development areas eligible. But suffice to say, there is a set of tests that have to be made and accepted by the city council ultimately is the determinant of whether or not the TIF district is adopted or not. You would be in a recommending mode later in this process. There are 4 categories or types of TIF. For developed or improved property, we have to make a finding that 5 of 13 factors that are listed in the statute have been identified within the area that is being determined to be a TIF. For undeveloped property, there is a separate set of 6 factors, and at least 2 of those factors have to be defined. There's another test independent of those 2 types of TIF districts for conservation area, 3 of 13, plus the fact that all of the improvements within that area have to, not all, excuse me, the majority of improvements, buildings and structures have to be at least 35 years or older. That would be the trigger for allowing for this conservation determinant. And then there's a series of industrial park TIFs that have another set of standards. Suffice to say, again, that the statute's very specific on what is eligible and what is not, and that determination has to be made in advance of going through the rest of this process. So here is a list of the types of characteristics that can be determined to be in place or not. And it's dilapidation, which is essentially the decay of the physical structure of improvements. Buildings are falling into disrepair. Obsolescence, and there's a couple kinds of that, but essentially that they are, the market for the original use of the building or site is no longer appropriate, and they are, the building does not meet the standard for which it was originally intended. Deterioration is another form of physical decay on the site. Presence of structures below the minimum code standards, and that's code building code, fire code, health code, zoning code, all of which can be no longer met by the current improvements. There may be illegal use of the site. There may be excessive vacancies, which is that we recognize that not every building in a community is regularly used, and it's not just that it is vacant, but it is excessively vacant, that it's responding, it under normal circumstance should, instead of being 10% vacant or some number, it's 50% or mostly vacant. And the last on that left column being lack of ventilation, light, and sanitary facilities. There is a series of other ones: inadequate utilities, excessive land coverage, deleterious land use or layout, or physically saying that the use of the property is not in the best interest of the community or consistent with the plan. Environmental cleanup, an important one. Lack of community planning, which is to say that the community did not have influence over how the property was developed. It did not have a plan in place when the property was developed. And the decline in total equalized assessed value in 3 of the last 5 years, which is compared to the assessed valuation of the whole community. So one of the criteria is that this property, whether developed or undeveloped, is not increasing in value at the same rate as the rest of the community, or that it's literally going down in value. I'm not going to go through another list, but they are very consistently trying to examine whether or not there are physical improvements or market conditions which are no longer appropriate for the natural market to respond to in a positive way. So the process of establishing a TIF requires first, in the cases where there are 75 occupied residential units, or potentially 10 or more relocated residential units, a feasibility study has to be. Where there are no, where you have less than 75 occupied units, or there isn't going to be 10 relocated homes, that feasibility study, which is essentially a market feasibility study, does not need to occur. The adoption of a plan and program, and you will, if you go through this process as we anticipate, the Planning Commission would be particularly responsible for the review of the plan. The program typically is the budgetary aspect of it, the financial aspect, where the money comes from, where it goes to. It's likely that that would be a shared responsibility with the Property and Public Lands Committee. If we have the relocation of significant number of homes, or if there's a total number of dwelling units, again, exceeding 75, a housing impact study has to occur. There is a process by which we notify all the property owners within the district, plus within 750 feet outside the district, and not exceeding 750 total property owners. There is a interested parties registry, which is to say that anyone in the community, anyone within Lake Forest may say, I'm really concerned about this, or I'm really interested in this, and I want to be notified of the public meetings that are related to this. They sign their, usually it's email and regular mail address, and we give notice to those folks to make sure they have an opportunity to speak to the issues. There's a joint review board established, and that body is made up of the other taxing jurisdictions plus a representative from the city and a representative from the public. So you have school board official, park district official, et cetera. There's actually a limited number. You don't do the mosquito abatement district and the like, but the county gets a representative. But that body, the joint review board, will review the eligibility of the district and how it meets the standards in the statute. They get to make a recommendation. They have a limited time to review that and make a recommendation. If their recommendation is positive, you move forward. If their recommendation says, we don't think it's eligible, or we have a concern about the way you're using the potential monies, they force a substantial majority vote at City Council. It's not a veto, but it encourages an even stronger conclusion by city council that it's an appropriate district. There would be a public hearing. The statute allows for either you or the city council to have that public hearing. That choice isn't made because we're not that far down the road, but typically the plan commission will hold the public hearing. And then that plan commission recommendation goes to city council. City council has a window in which they can not, and then can, and then cannot. There is a 14 to 90-day window in which they can adopt the ordinances. They can't adopt it before 14 days, and they can't adopt it after 90 days, but there's a window for them to adopt or not adopt the ordinances. So what does the plan include? This is the document that you would be most concerned about. The plan includes a description of the boundaries, why there is a need for redevelopment, the recommendation of the but for this use of TIF, this area will not develop to the standards or consistent with the comprehensive plan. There are redevelopment goals and objectives. What do we intend to do with the district, including the use of funds, an explanation of how the land would be used, so literally a land use plan is included in the document. There is a budget for the life of the TIF district, including the total TIF eligible costs that create, to some extent, a cap on the size of the district based on how much change in property values will drive how much budget available and the improvements that go with it. That cap essentially means that there can be shifting and sharing of where those funds are used within the budget, but it is a bit of a cap on the total amount, and we can talk about that in more detail. There's an evaluation of the fiscal and programmatic impact on other taxing bodies, which is to say, is this development going to generate costs for other taxing bodies that are not, or they're unrepresentative of what they would receive at the end? And when we talk about the life cycle of this, there's an evaluation essentially of, okay, is this going to cause an unreasonable number of students, an unreasonable number of folks using park facilities, et cetera. Description of the process to amend the plan, a statement of conformance with the comprehensive plan, because we have to find ultimately that what you're proposing to do with the TIF district is consistent with your general plan and why this is essentially an implementation tool and a timetable for the overall redevelopment. Okay. What can you use TIF funds for? Well, it does require some administration over a 23-year period of the TIF district, and so there are expenses that can be paid for the public administration of the document and the process. Property acquisition or assembly is often necessary to put small properties together to make them useful for a developer, to assemble properties for public improvements and the like. Those are expenses that can be paid for by the TIF district, and in particular we call attention to the fact that you can use them for either ultimately public properties or potentially for property that would be made available for private development and private improvement. That is an eligible expense. Rehabilitation or renovation of existing public and private buildings, and note there that it is of existing public and private buildings. Construction of public works or improvements, job training, relocation expenses if you're going to move a current user or owner of property, their expenses are paid for. Financial costs, including the interest assistance that may be provided to a developer to write down the cost of interest that they are paying for on their improvements. All the studies and surveys that are necessary to advance the plan, the marketing of individual sites or the district as a whole, but not just promotional costs. These are specific, how do we get the property sold? Professional services, demolition and site prep, and it's not relevant here, but in municipalities above 100,000, they can pay for daycare expenses along with it. There's a whole series of very interesting rules that got written in for communities of 500,000 or larger. I wonder who that might be. Some restrictions. There are limitations on what you can make use of the TIF funds for. Dollars must remain in the TIF district. They can be, however, if there happens to be two adjacent TIF districts, money can be generated in one through increment and paid as expenses in the other. But since, and that is not an uncommon activity to have two adjacent TIF districts, one that might have been 20 years old and a new one that's created next to it. The city of Chicago, in its infinite wisdom, has more concern is raised by the public on the fact that they do this constant moving of dollars from one TIF to the next than the issue of what they're making use of the money on within a district. But, so keep in mind, you can't use TIF monies to pay for improvements, public or private, outside of a TIF district. The money is generated there, it has to be used there. You're not allowed to develop a golf course or public lands that are currently for camping or hunting or nature preserves. There's a remarkable list of things that they have special concern about at the state level. There are limitations that, there's a limitation on the use of funding for consultants, and that's in the public interest to make sure that you're not just giving the money away to the consultants. Some new municipal public buildings are not allowed. Specifically, you can't use the money to create a new police department or police facility. General marketing of the district is not allowed. Make-whole agreements are not allowed. So what's a make-whole agreement? Clearly, there is a period of time in which the tax revenues that are generated from a TIF district are used only for the improvements within the TIF district, and the other taxing jurisdictions who may have increases in their costs, you're not allowed to use the money and say to the park district, here's $100,000 to compensate for the fact that you lost the increases in taxes that new development would have brought. You can't single out another taxing jurisdiction. The law specifically creates money that can be used with a formula to compensate for school children that are generated from the site. That's the only, and it's not an exception, it's a specific use of funds, but it's not a make-whole situation. And it can't be done to the other taxing jurisdictions. It's simply to the school districts. And then ultimately, there is a limited period of 23 years that this is in place. But keep in mind, it can be shorter than 23 years if you accomplish your goals in a shorter period of time and you need not make additional public improvements, you can cut it off early. In some circumstances, the district doesn't accomplish its goals within its life of 23 years, and a community can go to the state legislature and through a change of the law can have their specific TIF district extended for additional time not exceeding a total of 35 years. And that has occurred throughout the state, but from a public policy perspective, 23 years is the maximum life unless you have the law changed, okay? Of the now 1,100 some odd TIF districts around the state, there are less than 40 extended TIF districts. So it's a very small number of districts that go through that extension. So what's typically the projects that are included? Redevelopment of substandard, obsolete, or vacant buildings, financing general public infrastructure improvements, particularly the stuff that's underground, development of residential housing in areas of need. And when we say residential housing, we're talking about affordable housing specifically. Cleaning up of polluted property, improving the viability of downtown business districts is probably the #1 reason that TIF exists. It was focused initially, and it is designed primarily as being a redevelopment activity within or adjacent to downtowns. That was why we put TIF districts in place. Providing infrastructure to develop a site for new commercial and industrial uses, and rehabilitating historic properties. These are the ones that are most often the purpose of those TIF districts. So, some roles and actors that will be involved in the process. Typically, we do the technical work of establishing that it is eligible and establishing a draft land use plan, working with you to determine what's in the best interest and consistent with the comprehensive plan, and how the money which would be generated will induce private investment. Remember, that's the key question. How do we use public funds, leverage those public funds for private investments that will return value to the properties and to the community? The Plan Commission's role is primarily one of recommendation, and in this case, we think likely to be focused on the land use and the planning process as opposed to the financial process. You're going to touch on the financial parts of it, but your primary focus will be how is it consistent, how do we make it consistent with our goals for the long-range health of the downtown, if that's where you're talking about, or some other place in the city, if that's a TIF district later. The Property and Public Lands Committee is probably going to be more focused on the issues of the budgeting aspects, and potentially, if it's public property, on the sale and the introduction or inducement, the attraction, if you will, of private investors, developers to those properties. The Joint Review Board has an evaluative responsibility to consider whether it meets the statutory requirements. They, by the way, also have a continuing responsibility going, if the TIF is adopted, they meet once a year to evaluate whether or not it's continuing to meet the goals that are established in the document itself. The Plan Commission is likely to hold the public hearing, and ultimately it's the City Council that makes the decision. So as you go forward, if a TIF district is adopted, you've got that Joint Review Board that meets annually. You've got a compliance report that gets sent to the state of Illinois annually to show them that you are legally using the funds and you're meeting your responsibilities. That's a staffing responsibility to report. An annual TIF report is essentially generated not just for the state but for the public, so that they can be aware of the fact that there are continuing efforts to redevelop the property and how that is functioning, how the returns on that investment are making improvements in the community. And every public investment, whether it's in infrastructure or assembly of property, has to be part of the budgeting process the City Council goes through and approves as a public document. So who's using TIF? There's more than 1,100 units of government, or 1,100 TIF districts in the state so far. I believe that the City of Chicago on its own has more than 150. Lake Forest, beginning in 1988, established a tax increment district. We'll go into that one in more detail. A very successful TIF district that will wind up on December 31st of this year. That TIF district, the West Lake Forest TIF, included 62 parcels in the beginning, 180 acres. The initial equalized assessed value, which is that that number that we talked about in the beginning as the base value, was $2,396,000 at the start of the TIF district. So the number to keep in the back of your head was, the starting number was $2.3 million of value. That was the equivalent at the time of 0.14% of the total equalized value throughout the community. So less than 0.25% of the total value within the community. And the original goals at the time were to provide land use and economic to create and document the land use and economic plan for that area, to encourage redevelopment of vacant property and underutilized sites, and to create diversity and strengthen the city's residential and commercial property tax base. Now, I can tell you, I actually was physically doing the eligibility report in 1987 and 88. And this was before commuter rail service was ready for this site. And the decision was, we're gonna have a rail station there. Let's make maximum use of it to spin off development. The same way that the rail station in downtown, 120 odd years ago or whatever, was the opportunity to develop a community. If you may be aware that the rail companies, and specifically the Northwestern Rail Company, was given land by the federal government as a way of paying for the rail. Essentially, they had a 1 square mile area on each of these 1 mile apart kind of sites that they sold for development, that became the ring of, well, it's not really a ring, a sort of necklace of downtowns along the North Shore where the rail station sites were. Well, essentially the same thing on the Milwaukee Road line is what we're talking about for this site. So that was the district that was established at the time. And yes, I can tell you that, you know, in the center was that rail station that was to be developed. So this chart, starting in '88, where the base value was established, shows the growth of equalized assessed value over the 23-year life. So this is the increment. And it went from that, what did we say, $2.3 million, and rose up to $60 million at 2008. And then we had the collapse of the market, which has seen a decline in the property values for these last 3 years of reporting. Nonetheless, at the time that we established this, I believe that the budget and the document itself called for about $20 million of equalized assessed value. So we beat it almost 3 times. What did you accomplish? You created that station and the commuter lot. There were improvements to Everett Park. Within the TIF district, you can make public improvement. Outside the TIF district, you don't have that ability. You had a fire station built and paid for by the TIF, the installation of sanitary sewer and water mains to encourage development of residential property primarily. Traffic improvements. Don't remember if that was at Waukegan and Everett, or I think that was right. Streetscape improvements, $7.8 million contribution to a school within the district to make physical improvements on their site. And the comprehensive upgrade of the fiber optic telecommunication network within that area. That was the public expenses. These are the private investment that responded to that public improvement. Construction of the Sunset Food Shopping Center, the Lovell's Restaurant, the Northern Trust, Fifth Third and Private Bank, and residential development, 32 dwelling units and 96 single-family homes, and the Forest Square mixed-use development. So just to remind you of very attractive private investment that came as a result of that set of public investments. So it's intended to expire. It will expire, sorry, that's, let's be very specific. The end of the 23-year period is 12/31 this year. What happens then? That increase of just under $60 million in equalized assessed value now gets placed on all of the taxing jurisdiction's tax base. So what happens during the process? For some reason, I managed not to have the graph I had originally included, and I somehow cut that out, and I apologize. Here's the shape of what occurs during a TIF, the life of the TIF. You establish this base. You do not freeze it, but it's literally written down on the books of the county. And each year, the equalized assessed value is measured against that base. During the life of the district, all of the taxing jurisdictions tax the way they always do against the base equalized assessed value. And during that 23-year period, that base remains the same. The increment, using the same tax rate, all of the tax rate, all of the taxing jurisdictions, applied to that increment generates tax increment revenue. That goes into a fund and is able to be used only for the purposes identified in the TIF district within the TIF district. At the end of the life, what we're about to approach is that the tax, the equalized assessed value, the value of homes, businesses, and the land that has grown now to over 60 million now, just under 60 million. All of that is now taxable as of the first of the year by all of the taxing jurisdictions. And so they receive a significant increase in the value of the district. Now, there's a complication due to the rules that put tax caps in place. And a tax cap is not a cap on the revenue, it's a cap on the assessed value. When this district expires, all of the difference between, all of the incremental value from the 2.3 million up to the $60 million, so just under $60 million of equalized assessed value, will be put on the tax rolls, and it will look like new construction. And that's important because the tax cap only allows for an increase on an annual basis of the cost of living, or 5%, which is ever lower. And if you put this on, it would look like appreciation in value, and they would not be able to increase their base, if you will, taxable base. But there's a specific rule that says, no, this is like new development, and this gets added to your base, and you can go, so it's essentially that 5% or COLA limit is irrelevant to these dollars. That means that the elementary school district and the high school district and the park district, etc., all receive this money, and they're not limited by the tax cap because of this change. Technicality, we have to specifically have an ordinance passed that says it's done, and we ask the county now to deliver those taxes to all the taxing jurisdictions. If there is revenue, incremental revenue, that is in the TIF fund, a separate fund that the city maintains solely for these purposes, if there is revenue still in that fund that is unused for public improvements, et cetera, that gets distributed to all the taxing jurisdictions as surplus on the basis of their existing tax, pro rata to their tax rate, if you will. So it gets distributed to everybody. And I guess we currently anticipate that there is a surplus of $2.2 million that's going to get distributed to all the taxing jurisdictions. Now, as a whole, all of them will split fairly the $2.2 million. Okay. How much of that didn't make sense? No, I shouldn't ask it that way. Again, let me go backwards to the first thing I said, which is that they made a big mistake when they said this is going to be called tax increment financing, as opposed to some other name that didn't use tax in the title, because that immediate response by a lot of community members is, well, it's going to cost me more, right? So depends upon where you put a TIF district in your community. Some will have residential units, some will have, in most cases, it'll have commercial properties. Do I know that I have a TIF district that's a burden to my property? Whether you're in the TIF district or outside the TIF district, your property, one, is assessed by the township, and the tax is applied by the county, and you pay the same tax on your property whether it's in the district or not. Let me repeat that. This base value plus whatever increment does not affect you as an individual, because your value and the entire tax rate of all the taxing jurisdiction is applied to your property, and it's not applied differently whether you're in or outside the district. It's that the money can be used differently. So there is no increase in tax. This is not a tax. It is a way of using the revenues that are generated by development. So we talk about leveraging the public investment. Its sole purpose is to encourage private investment, which will raise property values. Ultimately, everybody shares this fairly substantial, well, if we're as successful as we did here, all the taxing jurisdictions will, at the end of the district, whether that's 23 years or shorter, benefit by that very substantial increase in value. Still, we believe that this is a planning tool. Yes, it's got everything to do with how you collect and spend these dollars, but you use it for economic development. You use it to encourage development that isn't otherwise going to happen because the market doesn't do it on its own. She's typing away. I don't know what she's typing.
How about if we open it up for questions?
Please.
Commissioner Culbertson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Forgive my ignorance. I may not be the only one out there who doesn't quite understand how this works, but how does TIF funding or financing actually work? I mean, how does the money flow? How does the district collect money, and how do they spend it?
Okay. It's not a, it is a fundamental question, and that is, taxes are collected twice a year. We pay our taxes in the spring and in the fall. And those monies go to the county collector and then get distributed to the taxing jurisdictions. They send a check. The county is responsible for comparing the initial base value of the district to what the current value, EAV, of the district, and separates the tax revenues into two checks. Well, the one that goes to the city because it has a tax rate applied, and actually there's a check that goes to all of the taxing jurisdictions. But there's a separate check that goes to the city's tax increment district. And that's collected, the check is deposited in the tax increment fund. Now, I talked about the document itself having a budget. It includes an estimate of how much revenue over this period of time is going to be generated. And so the city anticipates that they'll have a certain amount of funds available for public improvements. And there's two ways that it can spend money. It can spend money by waiting for the check from the county to come in and use those monies for public improvements. That's the pay-as-you-go plan. Or it can anticipate revenues coming into it in the future and can make investments by either borrowing from itself or by borrowing money, banks, bonds, whatever, and making public improvements that will encourage more value to come in. So, to the extent that the revenue is predictable, because you know the market's going to respond, that you're absolutely confident that there is a market for the kinds of improvements that are likely to occur, then the city feels more confident in being able to borrow funds, make improvements, and wait for the revenues to return. But it's monies that come in on a twice annual basis and go into the fund and are able to either reduce, either to make improvements right away or to pay off debt. Debt that's incurred for the purpose of getting enough funds to make a public improvement of some size. You know, let's face it, infrastructure is a lumpy thing. You can't buy, you know, a part of an extension of a utility, or you can't make a part of a road and wait for the money to come in and make the other part of the road. So those are capital expenses that often have to be put in place before the market will positively respond. In the case where a city owns property, it can sell property. And it can sell it to a developer or private property owner who is committed to making improvements, to raising the value of the site. And it therefore has the authority, if you will, to select a developer who shows the most interest and the most capacity to achieve the community's goals, to attract a developer to a site and say, if you will agree that you will put this kind of development that meets our goals and objectives, our comprehensive plan, we will sell it to you. And you will make the investment that will raise the revenues that pay for our expenses.
So the private developer doesn't actually get TIF funds?
The private developer doesn't receive TIF funds directly, but there are kinds of expenses that are eligible that can be passed to the private developer to create incentives for their investment. Now, what does that mean? You can extend utilities, you can clear the site, you can remove contamination on the site, and you can do that one of two ways. You can do it yourself as the city, clean it up, or you can have the developer make those improvements and reimburse them. There are other things that can provide incentives. One of those that I mentioned really quickly at the beginning was interest rate subsidies. The law says that up to 30% of the interest that the developer pays for construction costs can be reimbursed by the TIF district in any given year. So if they're borrowing $10 million to prepare the site and construct improvements, the interest on those notes or bonds or whatever they get is up to 30% of that interest can be paid for as a expense by the TIF district. The assembly costs of land to prepare the site, to take small properties and make a developable property, those expenses can be paid for by the TIF district. In some communities, that means that the city, village, whatever, acquires property and then writes the cost of the land down. Writing down the cost means essentially subsidizing to make it more attractive than what the market was prepared to pay for the site. And so by using that write-down expense, you can pass another incentive on to the developer. But it isn't that they receive the revenue check from the county. It doesn't go to the developer. It goes to the city for eligible expenses.
Got it. May I ask just a couple more?
Sure.
What body actually approves the TIF district?
City council.
So it's your locality that can identify.
There is no state or federal authority of any kind to say yes or no to a local municipality's decision to adopt a TIF.
Okay. And then, so the compliance report and the annual report,
Is to keep you honest.
and goes to who?
Department of, I think, they keep changing their name, it's DCOE or something, is essentially one of the economic development departments as a
State of Illinois?
state of Illinois, for the purpose of essentially assuring that the local municipality is meeting the standards of the TIF law, and to make that document public so the community can go to the JRB and say, on an annual basis, they are or are not meeting the responsibilities. But the state of Illinois has no authority to come in and say, you're in violation.
One last question. You mentioned a surplus. I'm not sure I quite understood. What happens when the TIF ends and there is a surplus?
We distribute to all of the existing taxing bodies a pro rata share of the total amount of the surplus based on their pro rata share of the total tax rate.
Why would a city want to have surplus at the end of the TIF?
It's common for the city to accumulate money in the TIF district before it spends the money, because there are costs that, for instance, if you know that you're going to, in the 10th year, hey, thank you. In the 10th year of the district, I'll go over this in a second. In the 10th year of the district, you know that you intend to extend a road. Well, you essentially accumulate dollars in that fund waiting for that expense. And that occurs over the life of the district. If it's 23 years, you keep accumulating, and then you have expenses, and you accumulate and you have expenses. Some of those expenses, for instance, are to pay debt. So in the city's interest, it may go out to the market and to the bond market and borrow money for some big expense. And then it uses the stream of income that's anticipated as the measure of how much they can borrow. And when that income comes in over time, over the life of the district, it pays off that debt. Should it use every last dollar before it goes, before we
Roll it up.
create surplus? The city is responsible to exercise reasonable judgment about what public improvements are necessary to achieve the end goal, which is development, private development. It is not a license to take money and use it frivolously. It is a responsibility to be shepherds of these revenues. And so the city uses good judgment about, do we have expenses that are coming in the near term? We have to put away monies to pay for that. It is not uncommon for surplus to be declared during the life of the district, so that you only need a certain amount of this revenue. If you're really, really successful, as we were here, you can, during the life of the district, choose to distribute surplus even before the end of the district. In fact, the law says there are certain conditions in which you are not allowed to keep surplus. You have to distribute it.
And if I can just add a couple comments related to that. Keep in mind, as Lee said, this district was projected to result in 20 million. It resulted in 60 million. So the projects that were intended were more than covered. However, in recent years, the city council did look carefully at how we could spend some additional TIF monies. The work that has been done in the last 5 years along Waukegan Road, the lighting that was added. Just last weekend, I think the landscaping in the median just south of McDonald's was finished. That was all, those were all projects that were scheduled with the intent of using the surplus for the benefit of that area. the city is also, has been in discussions and has been working to get a grant for an underpass under the railroad tracks out at the West Side Station. We're kind of scrambling, we're up against a timeline, but that's an example of a project that we've really been trying to put together to use up some of these funds. And then the final piece is, we did in the last couple of years, as we talked to the other taxing districts, we acknowledged that there would be some surplus. So some of these other taxing bodies, having waited all this time to get this money, really have relied on seeing some of that surplus come back. So it's not for lack of giving it careful thought, but really trying to be, as Lee said, reasonable and fair.
Can a TIF wind up in a deficit?
I'm sorry, repeat.
Can a TIF district wind up at term end with a deficit?
Yes.
Is there penalty for that, or?
The debt or the lack of funds,
Shortfall.
a shortfall, if you will, becomes the responsibility of the
city.
of the community.
Right, okay.
If you borrow too much or you spend too much and you haven't done that in a way that is respectful of the realistic market's ability to create new value, you can present a lack of funds to pay off your debt. So we are all cautious that we don't get too far ahead.
Commissioner Lay?
Yes.
I just wanted to thank you for helping me understand better.
Mr. Brown, my first question follows up on that. May the city require of a developer that if that situation does occur, that there is a shortfall at the end, can they write that into the contract up front, that the developer can be responsible for part or all of that shortfall?
Great question. And before I cross the line into a legal opinion, I will tell you that the IRS is the party responsible to determine whether or not borrowing is tax exempt or taxable. There have been rulings by the IRS to say that when a city engaged in a contractual relationship with a developer, that they essentially they lost the public purpose test that essentially made the bonds taxable. And that can be a very painful thing to the bond buyer and gets passed on in a penalty form. So the answer is we don't want to do anything that creates an obligation in a way that presents the potential for losing that private purpose test. And that's the assumption that in the beginning, if you borrowed money, you were doing it as a tax exempt borrowing. If that's not the issue, you can ask the developer to guarantee. There are clawback abilities. There are ways of assuring that you don't put monies out so far in advance that it's not likely to be consistent with the staging or phasing of development. That's probably the more likely way you assure that you don't get that deficit condition, is that you stage your public improvements in a way that's just ahead of the market, if you will.
My second and last question is, it appeared to me when you described the city's first TIF that this thing raised so much more cash than was projected, that there may have been projects that came in as subsequently planned. In other words, they weren't in the original plan. How many of those projects that you listed came in during the middle of the plan as a result of it generating more value than was projected?
Several.
Like schools?
The school, I think, was anticipated.
The school was
Improvements to the
planned.
school was
Okay.
planned.
But one example was the extension of fiber.
Was
I don't even,
we
the
didn't know
extension of
fiber at the
in that
time.
area,
Okay.
yeah, I don't think 20 years ago we knew about fiber. So that's a very specific project that came up, I don't know, 5 years ago or something. And we worked with the school district and I think at time Abbott was extending some fiber, so we took the fiber to the limits of the TIF district to connect with other extensions that were occurring. So that's an example, but there were a number of projects that were thought up because there was money and there was a need within that
Okay.
district.
We're good, but we're not prescient.
Thank you.
Commissioner Kuchman.
Well, in my line of work, we deal with TIF districts fairly regularly, so I don't have too many questions, but I guess my one question would be to Mr. Brown is, would we be looking to Teska to provide us with the counsel to create the safeguards that were previously mentioned in questions? I mean, will you be making recommendations about disbursements of funds and use of funds, or simply the creation of the TIF district as our consultant?
That's sort of up to the city. The agreement we have right now is to do the preparation of the documents necessary to establish the TIF. We have on our team 2 other firms that are working with us. One is Business Districts, Inc., which will provide market analysis and understanding and will help us if we are working. We also, in addition to putting the documents together, we have an agreement that if you go forward with this, and if there is a case where a TIF district is in need of attracting developers, that we provide the service to attract the developers, essentially going through the request for qualifications and request for proposal process. And so Business District, Inc. will help us with that. The other member of the team is Kane McKenna Associates, who is both bond counsel and has unique evaluative capacity for just what you're asking for, which is how do you avoid putting a deal together that has potential liabilities that are unanticipated. So their expertise is added to ours. The answer to your question is, if asked, we are capable and are interested in providing that assistance to the city.
Okay, great. That's all my questions.
Commissioner Carris.
Sure, a couple of questions. We talked about the 23-year time frame. Is it possible to set up a TIF for a shorter period of time than 23 years? Or is that the statutory?
It's a limit.
Right.
And the statute says when you've achieved your goals and objectives, you can cut it off shorter. It isn't prudent to start with the assumption that it will be 10 years because our ability to assure that cash flow to pay off investments would require you to go through a big process to change it from 10 to 12 or something. Whereas you have at any given time the ability to cut it shorter. So good judgment says leave it as it is adopted as 23 years, and if you have discussions with other taxing jurisdictions about hurrying it up, you can do that. There's sort of 2 ways of hurrying this up. One is going back to the issue of the surplus. There are districts around the state that rather than cutting the district shy of the 23 years, begin to distribute the surplus early. And the TIF district is in place, allowing the community to continue to make the public investments that encourage more growth. But in the life of the district, they also have the ability to spin off revenue to the other taxing jurisdictions. It's probably worth looking at that chart, which is to say this is a cartoon of what we're trying to do. If you look at the x-axis as being time, starting from the date of adoption and moving out the 23 years, and the y-axis as being the equalized assessed value within the district, you're starting out here with a base value that we talked about. And as increment grows, you see this area representing the revenue stream that's available to pay for public improvements. And then when it's done, all of that assessed valuation is taxable by the other taxing jurisdictions.
Thank you. A couple other questions. I noticed on the west side TIF district that was established, is a large area. How are the borders established there? For our reference, if we go forward with this.
There has to be, here's my limited sense of law. You remember the term rational nexus? There has to be a connection between the boundaries of the district and the intent to make benefit to the properties within that district. So you can't just literally include a bunch of property that's gonna go up in value because it's gonna go up in value. You have to focus the district to the area that's necessary to collect the revenue and that you are intending to make improvements that will benefit the property. The short answer is probably it's a bit of an art and a bit of a science to say this is big enough, but not so big that we begin to include properties that are just not necessary for the district to be in. So part of the initial discussion is, okay, so what's our intent? What do we really intend to do, and how will we accomplish it? Can we do it within a very limited area? Because it's in every other taxing jurisdiction's best interest to limit it to only what's necessary. Yet you don't want to not capture real incremental change that you're inducing. So you may not be making physical improvements on the site next door. You may not be extending the utility in front of it, but you may have a direct impact on increasing the value of the property because the market on the site over here increases. So we draw the line carefully is the answer.
Right. And what are the ramifications with regard to impact fees? Does this cover impact fees per se? It may not be relevant specifically for what we may be looking at, but with residential, and you pointed out the fact that the school district, 67 for Everett School, got some certain improvements. I suspect, and I didn't look at the map close enough, that they were within the TIF district.
Yes, they were.
Oftentimes, if there's residential added, particularly over a certain density, there'll be requirements for additional improvements, maybe to the school district, maybe to intersection, maybe to XL, decel lanes, that sort of thing. Does this cover those types of improvements? And would you include that in the TIF district if they were required? For example, signalization, what have you?
The negotiation between the city and a developer, or in some cases, the negotiation between the school district and the developer, is completely independent of the generation of revenue. Now, if something like a new lane, a deceleration lane, were necessary as part of development, it's an eligible expense if it's within the district. It's a public improvement. It's within the public right-of-way, and so it can be paid for. And at that time, the city would be doing a calculation that says, what's necessary to induce this versus what's the normal responsibility of the development community to pay for these. In the case of the sort of, I think they're typically called donations to the school district in compensation for the additional costs that are generated by school children. There's two pieces to that puzzle. It's a little bit more complicated. One, you're gonna make the same donation responsibility for the developer based on the number of school children that are generated. That's the agreements are made directly between the property developer and the school district. But there is in the law specific compensation on a per student basis for additional students that are generated by new homes. If your TIF district generates new homes, there's a dollar formula based on the number of students. So I don't really think it's in any way directly connected to the impact fees, but certain things that impact fees or impact improvement, off-site improvements, that would come into the negotiation at the time of development can be made a public improvement and paid for by a TIF district if that's the city's decision.
I see. So, in the build on that, and one question we touched upon a little earlier was, the practical management of this, you talk about the JRB, which meets once a year. Is that a committee that's set up by the city council?
It is an invitation by the city council to each of the taxing jurisdictions to nominate their representative. They get to choose who their representative is.
Okay.
The city has a representative. There is a representative from the school district, the library district, the park district, the county.
The township?
The township can have a representative, but it's not a voting representative,
Okay.
interestingly. And I forget, and I think the same is if there's a separate fire district. I don't think they vote. I gotta double check that. But there's a certain number of voting members of this. And those voting members get to elect a public member, an additional member who is a member of the public. And then there's all kinds of specialty cases. If there's a certain number of dwelling units in the district, that public member must be a resident of that area. But, so it's more complicated than it really needs to be. But the answer is, no, it's not completely city council's choice on who those representatives are. It's really the other taxing jurisdictions who get to nominate their member.
But they just oversee or do an
All they
annual
get to
check.
do is once a
The money
year.
that's spent is done by the city itself.
That's correct.
and approved, and they just review it.
Administration
Okay.
of the fund, administration of the budget, and the intent to make improvement is entirely within the city's control. The oversight to assure that the city is consistent with its own plan and consistent with the statute, that's the JRB's responsibility.
Okay. And I have one last question, and I think this is probably for Kathy. Kathy, I know we're not looking at this with any specific properties in mind, but I know Laurel is a possibility. Are there any other properties in the city that may be a possibility for TIF financing that we're aware of at this point?
Certainly, there are other possibilities, but the Property and Public Lands Committee has started this discussion for the purpose of your upcoming study of the Laurel Avenue property.
Thank you. Thank you.
Commissioner Ziccarelli.
Lee, a question for you. Are real estate taxes the only taxes we're talking about as far as going back in the TIF fund? For example, are sales taxes over the 23 years distributed normally?
The answer is yes, they are distributed normally, only to the city. Or, you know, you got the 5% that goes to the state, and you got the 1% plus whatever additional you have established as the city amount. I think typically 0.75 in addition to the 1%, but I don't know what your number is. But the answer is it is not considered a requirement to include it within the TIF revenues. Now, the city can choose to donate, essentially, the incremental sales taxes for purposes within the TIF, but it's not a requirement. A slight deviation from this good question is, there was a period of time, let's see, this was an '88 TIF. It fell after the window. There was a period of time in which TIF districts were allowed to collect the state's share of sales taxes. But the state pretty quickly said, holy cow, that's a lot of money. And then they started retracting that, and they eliminated it completely. So it is property tax revenue.
Thank you. One other quick question. I think based on your presentation and all the questions and answers, I think I'm starting to get a good picture of it. If I name a couple of developments that I suspect were TIF districts, could you tell me possibly if they were?
Only if I know, but I'd be
Okay.
happy to.
I'm thinking Lakehurst redevelopment up in Waukegan,
Don't know.
possibly, and how about the Glen in Glenview?
The Glen may have some small areas that are tax increment, but the majority of it was simply the fact that they got the land free from the federal government as part of the BRAC closure. I do believe that they have some portion of it that is tax increment. The vast majority is driven by the fact that it's free land.
Thanks.
But, yeah, you know, other examples, downtown Highland Park, you know, the Port Clinton development was paid for by a TIF district. Downtown Waukegan, not Lakehurst that I'm aware of, but downtown Waukegan has 3 TIF districts. Um, let's see, what else can I think of offhand? Deerfield has 3. Evanston's downtown is 2 separate TIF districts that they can pass money from one to the other, but it's driven by a TIF district. And as I said, the city of Chicago has 150 of them.
Thank you.
Just one question. I mean, the advantages seem to be obvious. What are the disadvantages? Why would somebody not want to do this?
Why would somebody, or why would the community?
Both? Well, it's the same.
There is let's talk about the but-for just a second. The but-for TIF, this development will not occur. You have to be very sincere about that. The city council has to say, you know, this just isn't gonna happen by itself. The voices against it are the fact that for a 23-year period, the incremental values from new development and from increases in the appreciation of property values are not available to the other taxing jurisdictions, which means that their tax burden is spread over all the other properties within the community or within their taxing district. If you can't reasonably say that it's but for the TIF, then you are essentially saying we're borrowing funds from these other taxing jurisdictions that they would have otherwise received. So you need to be very certain that you're doing this with the true intent of inducing development that will ultimately benefit those other taxing jurisdictions, and it's not going to happen on its own. That's probably the primary reason, is to say you're locking this in essentially for a period of time. There are voices that will tell you that a TIF district being in place raises the market value and the cost of the land to the developer, and that they will inherently be paying more because the market says the TIF is going to pay for costs and other things. When it is private property and not held by the city, that means that it is raising values and potentially putting money in the pocket of the developer, and also raising the end value or end cost to a business owner or homeowner that would ultimately buy the end development. So we're essentially saying, if it's privately held property now and you put a TIF district in place, it's possible that you're going to make it a more expensive condominium, a more expensive retail facility. Now, if it's publicly held, you're not necessarily raising the value that someone is going to have to pay for it in the end.
Okay. Fine. Kathy, what's next?
You could go home.
Mr. Chairman, just
What?
do we need to approve the minutes of the last meeting?
No,
Yeah.
there are no minutes attached.
I didn't get
Last
them
meeting?
done, but I
Oh,
will.
really?
It was
No.
informational.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Lee will be back. Lee will be working with us very closely, so you
Okay.
don't have to feel like you have to get it completely, but we just wanted to start the educational process. If you don't have any other questions, there is no other business for you tonight, no public comment, so it's not a bad thing to adjourn early.
And any additional information from staff?
Oh, you do have your meeting schedule for 2013. If
Okay.
you would take action on that, we could make that official, and I believe all of the dates fall on your regular second Wednesday of the month. We included an August meeting and a December meeting. I know you usually cancel those, but given the bit erratic nature of items, we thought we'd get those on the schedule, and then the chairman always has the opportunity to cancel if there are no agenda items. So a motion to approve that would be good.
I'll tell you what, why doesn't everybody take a look at this, unless you already have? Did we, Did we get it in advance? We did get it in advance.
Yes.
Then I'll assume that everybody's taken a look at it and has put them dates in the calendar the way I have, because I'm anal retentive. Is there a motion for approval?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Carried. Do we need a motion to adjourn?
If
I
you wanna
will
go
enter-
home, sure.
I will entertain that.
Are we not meeting in December?
We do have
TBD.
items for you in December.
What's that?
We do have items for your meeting in
Okay.
December. You will hear the bike master plan. I don't know if we'll be ready with any other TIF-related information. You may have a special use permit for a restaurant that would be located within 150 feet of a residential zoning district. So there are a couple things that I think are coming together out there that may be ready for your December meeting and may not.
Okay,
Fine.
That's December 12th.
thank
right?
you.
My pleasure, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Thank you
I
very
don't
much.
have that date in front of me. It is the second Wednesday. It's your normal meeting date in December.
Good. Let's go home.
Thanks very much.
This one?